My name is John. I am the head of marketing here at Podbean, and I want to thank you for making the time in your day to join us to talk about different ways that you can really up your game in terms of how to record and how to produce your podcast. We're going to be talking about a variety of different things here. Please make sure that your chat is set to all panelists and attendees. That way, my coworker Ronnie can answer any questions that you may have during the webinar. Any questions that we don't get to, we will leave contact information at the end of the webinar to email us. And any webinars that you registered for, we send an email with the video within about 24 to 48 hours or so. So you'll be able to access the content post webinar as well. Now, I always like to put out with some of our webinars that some of our webinars are Podbean centric, meaning that we talk about a lot of the different tools that we offer. This is one of the ones in our webinar series where we talk really more about things in the industry of podcasting. And specifically for this, different sorts of audio gear and interfaces, and just a variety of different things that you can do to make sure that your podcast production is as professional as possible. So, when we talk about today's goals, one thing I want everybody to leave with is a deep or at least a high level understanding of the variety of different kinds of gear, such as microphones and headphones, that you can use to make your podcast recording and production the best that it can be. We also are going to talk about tips and tricks that you can use to record a high quality podcast and how to edit a podcast so that it sounds just as professional as anything that you listen to day to day and month to month. As we are in 2020 as well, we have a variety of different ways that people are recording their content nowadays, whether that be digital, whether that be remote recording, whether that be in their home studios. So, we're going to talk about the tools that are available for all of these different kinds of scenarios. And actually, what's really cool is we're also going to talk about how a lot of the gear that you would use in, let's say, a studio setting would also be able to translate nowadays into something that you use for remote recording and on the go recording as well. We're going to be speaking for about 50 minutes here or so. I'm going to be speaking for about 40 minutes of those, and I'll leave about 10 minutes of questions time at the end for any questions that you may have. So, a little bit about who we are first. If you aren't familiar with Podbean, we've been hosting podcasts since 2006. And when you think of a podcast host, you think of a variety of different things that you may be looking for. But a podcast host really takes that audio or video file and allows you to disperse it to a listenership or a viewership. But with a podcast hosting platform, there's so many other things that we can offer you. We offer solutions for private podcasts, for public-facing podcasts, ways for you to bring your podcast into the workforce, ways for you to make money with your podcast, ways for you to promote your podcast. And we also recently launched a brand new platform for audio live streaming, which gives you the ability to do remote recording or, as we talked about, just be able to do a professional broadcast live audio stream. And as of today, we've hosted over 500,000 podcasts on our platform. So if you're currently part of the Podbean family, thank you for being part of it. If you're not and you're looking for more information, please feel free to let us know. So, when it goes into recording and talking about how do I get the most professional podcasting quality I can, there's two different considerations I like to break down. First is the technical, the tangible, the things that we actually plug in, the things that we use to hit record, the things that we use to get the audio from our mouth into a computer, for example. And then we talk about the non technical side. So these are the intangibles, right? These are the things that are about the preparation for your podcast. So, first and foremost, as we are talking about producing right now, we're going to talk about the technical side first. And I think there's no better place to start than talking about knowing what gear you are using and knowing the gear that you currently have at your disposal. So, if you're joining this webinar, you may be considering starting a podcast, or you may already be in your first couple episodes, or you may be a veteran podcaster by this time and already have a bunch of podcast episodes under your umbrella. But knowing the gear that's at your disposal and knowing the gear that you currently have, learn the ins and outs, not necessarily just of what a microphone does or what an interface or headphones do, but know each specific piece of gear. Can you turn up the volume? Can you lower the volume? Can you use a specific piece of gear to plug into both your computer or into an interface? I will get into that in a little bit. Does your microphone have a specific polar pattern, meaning can you speak into a certain side to get a better audio quality? There's a lot of things, and knowing more about what gear you're using is only going to make your podcast production that much stronger when you hit record. How does each piece of gear affect the overall product too, right? If you are speaking into a microphone and the microphone that you have, let's say, is a little bit bassier than what you desire, how do you go back and adjust that later on? Are you looking for a microphone that has a little bit more of a brighter sound? These are things that you want to consider. Even something as small as how does a cable that you plug from your computer into your microphone or from your microphone into your interface, how does that affect the overall quality? Knowing these little pieces of information are going to help make sure that you can keep the most control of your production here. And also, you always want to understand your DAW of choice. Now, for those who may not be familiar with the term DAW, all that stands for is Digital Audio Workstation, which really translates down to that's the software that you're using to record and produce your podcast. If you're familiar with programs such as GarageBand, Audacity, Logic, these are all programs that you can record your audio into, and these are the programs that you can use to take your podcast production from start to finish. So there's a myriad of different ones. We'll talk about them in a little bit. But I just wanted to be able to highlight that just as we do continue this conversation here. You may hear me talk about a DAW or a DAW. That's what I'm referring to. Now, when we talk about the non-technical stuff, we talk about things such as preparing your content in advance. Podcasting in and of itself is a generally conversational medium when you listen to it. But there's a lot of preparation for even the biggest and smallest podcasts that goes into making sure they know what they're going to be speaking about on that specific episode and throughout their catalog of episodes. So knowing what you're going to be speaking about, knowing about approximately how long your episodes are going to be, knowing if, for example, you have advertisers who are advertising on your podcast where you're going to lay that advertising in, all of these things are going to allow you to, before you even hit record, make sure that you are as prepared as possible. You know what's going to be expected and delivered for this specific podcast episode and for all of your different podcast episodes. Preparation in advance of the content is, in my opinion, as much as we're talking about recording, is just as essential as having that $1,000 microphone. We all want the best gear possible for our podcast recording, but knowing a little bit of the roadmap of to what this episode is going to be and going to be about is going to make your podcast sound delivery wise that much more professional. So we're going to start talking briefly about some different essential recording gear that we would look into to make our podcast production the best it can be. And I want to start off and a little bit differently than we've started off in some of our other webinars here. I used to start off speaking about microphones, and we will get to that. But I think the headphones are going to be the most important part of your podcast production. And why is that? Here I have the Sennheiser HD 280 Pros, and these are a professional pair of headphones. But you don't need to have a crazy top of the line pair of headphones in order to have them do what they're supposed to do. Headphones are going to allow, or actually, they're going to make sure that you avoid picking up any extra audio echo or any audio bleeding from the stream or recording. So let's say you're recording your voice, but then let's say you're doing a live stream and people are calling in and that sound is coming back through the microphone. It could add a bit of unwanted feedback. It could add a bit of unwanted sound that becomes almost impossible to remove in post. So having a pair of headphones is going to be essential to make sure that there's no other noise that's coming from your recording device going back through the microphone as well. And we've had a lot of professional podcasts that are recorded with something as simple as a pair of AirPods or EarPods, for example. So if you're familiar with, for example, the headphones that come with an Apple device, those are great headphones to use. Also, none of the gear that we recommend here is a paid sponsorship. These are all things that we've tried and tested and are giving our honest thoughts and opinions on. So there's no sponsorships is what I'm trying to say. When it comes to headphones, you can get a more in-depth pair if you're looking to use them for a more honest experience in terms of what's coming through the recording, but don't think that you need to break the bank on the headphones. Any pair of headphones will do. These are my recommended go-to, though, for the most professional level. Next thing we talk about is the microphone. So not only do we want to have a pair of headphones that we can block out other noise, but we want to be able to make sure that we have a professional grade microphone to pick up the words that we're speaking. And there's a variety of different microphones out there. There's so many different companies. There's so many different types. But the two most common, and the two that we're going to highlight today, are a dynamic microphone and a condenser microphone. The dynamic microphone is going to be, or actually, I'll put it like this. A dynamic microphone is, in my opinion, the most well-rounded mellow microphone that you can get. It's the way that it's created is made to handle high volumes, and it's extremely durable, meaning that this is a great microphone whether you're in the studio or you are recording on a location, or you're doing some sort of remote where you're not necessarily in the same space all the time. With a dynamic microphone, they do take in a little less frequency range than their condenser microphone counterpart, but don't let that take away from the dynamic microphone being a high quality microphone. Dynamic microphones are amongst the most commonplace used in podcasting and everywhere for recording as well. Right here, I have the Samson Q2U, which is what I'm using now. And I actually like this one because you can plug this in via USB to your computer, or as you expand your recording, you can actually plug in an XLR cable and plug it right into an interface. If you're not familiar with what XLR and interfaces are as of right now, don't worry about it. We will talk about that coming up. I just want to highlight the multi-purpose of the Samson Q2U here. The next microphone that we're going to talk about is a condenser microphone. A condenser microphone is an extremely sensitive microphone. The way I like to talk about condenser microphones is that it's going to capture the most realistic version of what it's recording. Meaning, whereas a dynamic microphone is going to record less frequencies, the condenser is going to get much closer to how you actually sound or what it's picking up in the room. That being said, the architecture of it is a lot more sensitive than its dynamic counterpart, meaning that this is a great microphone for when you're in the studio, but if you're doing a lot of traveling, you may want to consider leaving the condenser microphone at home and using the dynamic microphones on your travel. Now, the one that I have here is actually the one I use in my home studio for my podcast, called the Rode NT1A. It's a great microphone. This microphone actually comes in a pack that has a few different helpful tools with it as well. Now, it's all well and good. We're talking about a variety of different microphones and different types and things like that. Now, which microphone should you use? I do want to go ahead and speak. Actually, I'm not going to speak. I'm going to bring up Samson here. Samson is the microphone company that we talked about here. They do a variety of different hardware in the recording industry here. So I'm actually going to play a quick video of one of our friends over at Samson to talk about their selection process of choosing the best microphone. And actually, let me go ahead and make sure that the computer sound is coming through. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Ryan from Samson, and we're going to talk about everything you need to get started with a podcast. We're going to go over microphone selection and some good audio tips to make sure that you sound as clear as possible. The two main kinds of microphones that we're going to talk about are going to be dynamic mics and condenser mics. Both of them come in analog or digital forms, either XLR or USB, but today we're going to focus mainly on the USB microphones. Condenser mics and dynamic mics both have their advantages and disadvantages. Let's go over them one at a time. Condenser mics tend to have a smooth, flat frequency response, which means they sound great for both the lows and the highs of someone's voice. They're also a more sensitive mic. This is advantageous when the mic is a little bit further away from you, but can also be a disadvantage if you're in a noisy room. Another thing with condensers is they can be made in many different sizes. So, for example, I have the G-Track Pro and the Go mic here. The Go mic is my go-to mobile recording solution. I can use an adapter and hook this up to my phone and record anywhere, even on a plane if I wanted to. Whereas the G-Track Pro has a much larger diaphragm, and this will let me sound great in my treated room. You can see I have my panels on the back here. sits on my desk and also acts as another interface. So I can plug an instrument or even a whole mixer in the back here and have way more control than I would with just a regular USB microphone. The cool thing about these is they can record in different polar patterns as well. So I can record in front or cardioid, in front and back on this mic, which is called figure 8, and I can record all around, which is omni. So great for a solo podcaster, one-on-one interviews, or a group around the table. However, with this being a more sensitive microphone, it'll also pick up things that we don't necessarily want to hear, like a noisy AC or something like that. And it's also a little bit more susceptible to distortion. So you definitely want to make sure you have a pair of headphones that you can listen along to what you're saying to make sure you're not peaking the levels. Dynamic microphones are less sensitive than condenser microphones. However, this can be used to your advantage. If you're in not the best sounding room, or there's something going on in the next room over, or a noisy AC or anything like that, this is going to be the mic for you. Because you have to be closer, it's going to focus more on your voice and just the sound source in front of it. The construction of dynamic microphones also make them more durable than their condenser brothers. So this way, if they're in a backpack, they're more likely to survive if they get dropped. They also have a smaller frequency range. However, this isn't a bad thing. Most radio broadcasters are using a dynamic mic, and this is a big part of what imparts that signature radio sound. The Q9U and the Q2U are unique in that they offer both a USB and XLR output. So you can have this, plug it into a mixer, you can plug it direct into your computer, or you could even do both at the same time, making both of these guys super versatile mics, great for any setups, whether it's a solo podcaster, or you've got 8 of them into an interface for a group interview. Let's talk about a couple things to make sure you're heard clearly. So one is the distance from the microphone. Let's open up your hand, place it in between the mic grill and your mouth, and that's a good place to start. As you get closer to the mic in a cardioid pattern, you'll typically hear more proximity effect. This is going to boost the low end in your voice, which is good if you have a higher voice, but maybe not so good if you have a lower voice. It might just cause it to sound muddy. This is a good place to start, and you can adjust from there. Another important thing is the axis of the mic. So whether you're speaking directly into the mic, like this, whether it's facing up or facing down, like this mic, it's going to change the sound too. Take a couple minutes, experiment, and see what works best for your voice. Another thing we want to do is watch out for plosives. If you take your hand, put it in front of your face, and say, pop, you'll feel the puff of air that filled your hand. When that fills the microphone instead of your hand, what you're going to get is an audible in your podcast, and it's going to distract the listener. The easiest way to get rid of that is to use a pop filter. We take this, mount it to our stand, put it in front of the microphone, and instead of that puff of air hitting the microphone, it's hitting this and getting diffused. Always be sure to have someone monitoring the levels, either yourself, listening through a pair of headphones, or a producer, to make sure that you're not clipping or getting your audio into the red. It's going to sound distorted and distract listeners from your podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. This is Ryan from Samson. Happy podcasting.
All right, perfect. So again, I want to thank Ryan from Sanson for lending his expertise on microphones and just really overall recording help as well. So just to make sure, does everybody see my screen okay? We should be sharing the microphone screen once again. Okay, we're just going to go ahead and keep going here. So, the first thing I do want to highlight that was spoken about from Ryan is just briefly touching in visual form what a polar pattern is here. So, when we talk about polar patterns with microphone, we talk about where the microphone is going to be picking up sound from and where it's not going to be picking up sound from. So I want to really be clear about that. It doesn't mean it blocks out sound from anywhere. It's just it's not picking up sound from a specific place. So when we look at these polar patterns here, all of where it's being picked up from is denoted in the green. Anything that's white is where the audio is not going to be picked up from. So a lot of microphones that are used in podcast recording are going to be of this cardioid pattern, much like the one that I'm using here, meaning that it's going to go ahead and pick up the sound that's directly in front of it and a little bit off to the side, but then behind it, it's not going to pick up any sound. Now, the reason why a polar pattern is so important is you may have a microphone that's a great high level microphone, but you're maybe not getting the level or the audio quality that you're expecting. By knowing the exact polar pattern of your microphone, you have the ability to make sure that you're talking into the right part of the microphone so that the microphone is picking up exactly what it should and how it should. The three types of patterns that I have here are the cardioid one, which is very common, as we talked about for podcast recording, a solo microphone. We also have the stereo one here, which means it's going to pick up what's going on the left and the right. We also have this one here, which for anyone who is using the Blue Yeti, this is one of the patterns that you can actually choose here. It's called omnidirectional, meaning it's going to pick up a 360-degree recording. So if you have a lot of people, let's say a round table, or you're conducting a conversation with many people at a table, omnidirectional would be the way to go. And if you're not familiar with the kind of polar pattern that your microphone has, you can always go on Google, type in the name of your microphone, and type in polar pattern, and it'll give you what polar pattern your microphone is. Also, on many of the microphones around the ring of them, right under the microphone itself, it'll actually, a lot of them will have the polar pattern of said microphone. So different ways that you can find out what exactly is the polar pattern of your microphone. If you haven't purchased a microphone yet, or you're wondering what's going to work for you, again, I would really consider this. I would consider, think about what your use case is going to be. If you're going to be recording a solo podcast, a microphone that's got a cardioid pattern may be the best for you. If you're going to be recording a bunch of people at once, omnidirectional may be the best also. But maybe if you have 4 or 5 different people in the same room, they're all plugged into different microphones, the cardioid may be best for each of them. Now, we've talked a little bit about the interface here, but at the end of the day, all an interface does is it allows you to get sound in and out of your device. So this you can plug in your microphones into. If you're an instrumentalist, you can also use this to record music as well. You can plug in a variety of speakers, headphones, and a variety of different audio tools and change the volumes on each of them. So you can make sure that you're getting the most clear audio quality possible. Um, what I love about an interface is not only can you plug in one microphone, many of them will allow you to plug in more than one as well. So if you are a solo podcaster and you're only recording yourself, you may need an interface that only has one channel. However, this one here, the Focusrite Scarlett 2i4, you can see has two. So if you're recording a podcast that has a conversation between you and somebody else, you don't need much extra technology. All you need is the interface. You can plug in another microphone and you're able to get clear audio quality for both you and your other podcaster. And if you notice here, each of these microphone sections has a little dial. That dial is going to allow you to change what's called the input gain, meaning how loud is the volume of the microphone before you hit record. If again, as Ryan was saying, if you're speaking a little bit quieter, you turn up the gain. If you find that your microphone is clipping, and what we mean by clipping is that there's a bit of audio distortion when you are speaking, you could turn the gain down. But using that gain knob is going to allow you to even get a higher level of quality from your microphone and from your recording. And then here you also have the ability, like we talked about, to have the adjustment for your speaker and for your headphones as well. So during the recording, this gives you the ability to monitor how the sound is coming through and make any adjustments on the fly as well. Also, if you are using a condenser microphone, you should see this little button here that says 48V. That is called phantom power. So if you have a condenser microphone and it's not working, you've plugged it in, you're wondering what's going on, turn on that 48V, and that's going to give it the power it needs in order to work within your recording setup here. And there are a few other things that we want to talk about here, some nice to have, some needs that will make your recording experience even better. XLR cables, if you're plugging your microphone into an interface, that is the way in which your microphone gets into your interface. So make sure that you have XLR cables. I will always recommend a pair of speakers for mixing as much as we talk about headphones. Once you've done the recording, once you're all good to go, I think speakers are going to give you the most authentic way that your podcast is going to sound. So always mix in speakers. Try not to mix in headphones. Make sure, as we talked about, your digital audio workstation, you have whether one or a few that you're using. Make sure that you're all good to go on that. You have a variety of different things that I will always recommend. Two things I will recommend that are kind of, I used to put them under nice to haves, but I'm going to put them as a recording need now, are a mic stand and a pop filter. A mic stand is going to make sure that your microphone is sitting on a stand without you having to adjust it or touch it during the recording. This is both going to remove any sorts of electronic interference that your hands could actually be causing, and it's going to remove any sorts of shuffling sounds that could be picked up during it just by you shuffling it in your hands. The pop filter is also going to allow you to remove, as Ryan talked about, these plosives within your recording. And a pop filter, like I said, is only a couple bucks. So it's definitely one of the things that I would recommend. That Rode NT1A that we spoke about earlier actually comes in a kit. That's the microphone and has a pop filter and an XLR cable. So they really kind of take care of you when it comes to what you would need as a podcaster plugging into an interface. And when we talk about digital audio workstation, we want to think of a few different things considering what our use is going to be. There's a variety of different ones that you can choose from. GarageBand, Audacity, Pro Tools, and Logic are some of the most popular ones and some of the most common that you'll find out there. Number one, GarageBand I think is great if you're on an Apple environment, and the reason I say that is because GarageBand is free. If you have an Apple device, it's free. So you don't need to go any further than really just opening up your computer or your iOS device. If you are looking for a free solution that's also pretty powerful on both Windows and Apple, Audacity is completely free as well. You can go to, I think it's audacity.com is the website. But again, it's a really powerful interface as well. You can also look into some more advanced ones as well, such as Pro Tools and Logic Pro. These are industry leaders in audio production here. And again, if you are looking to use it for more advanced needs, Pro Tools and Logic will definitely give you that. But again, if you are just starting your podcast or you find that you don't have the need to upgrade, save the money, use GarageBand and Audacity. But you can also look into these other two as well as you up your podcast production. Now, we also talk about the ability to record mobile and in studio. Again, if you are using a laptop and these are installed on your laptop, really all of them become a mobile solution. But if you are, let's say, using an iOS device or an Android device, you may want to look into some different digital audio workstations as well. GarageBand, I think, is great because GarageBand, like I said, is GarageBand is free on iOS as well, and it's still got a pretty powerful interface there. So definitely take a look into these as DAW selections of choice. Now, when we talk about recording, we talk about just making sure that before you hit record, your environment is exactly how it should be. Again, before you hit that record button, make sure that the microphone's in the right place. Consider the polar pattern of your microphone. As you see with the image here, the person is sitting in front of the microphone. And while they're speaking off to the side right now, I'm sure when they turn around, they'll be speaking right into the top of the microphone. But for the prepping and recording levels also, this is where that interface comes into play in those headphones. When you put on those headphones and you're monitoring, make sure that there's no clipping in the audio before you hit record. Also, make sure that your volume is at where it needs to be for a professional recording volume. Think about the podcast side of it. So the non-technical stuff we talked about before. What are you going to be talking about on this specific episode? Do you have a format or a layout to your podcast? Meaning, do you have different segments? Are you just a 90-minute talk show that doesn't have any breaks? Are you putting in any advertising? To that end, are your podcasts always of varying lengths? Or do you have a generally consistent level of podcast time? Are your podcasts usually 45 minutes? Are they 20 minutes? Are they an hour? These are all things to consider that before you hit record, you know how long it's going to take, you know how long you're going to be recording for, you know how long each episode approximately is going to be. So again, making sure that you're prepped before you hit record from both the technical and the preparation side can only make your podcast production that much better. Now, where are you going to be recording is the next step that we talk about. A lot of people are recording within one environment, meaning that they're in a studio recording, for example. Now, There's two different kinds of environments that we talk about. We talk about studio recording, and we also talk about on the go remote recording, right? But the studio recording means that basically everything is going to be consistent episode to episode. You'll have access to the same gear, your computer's going to be the same, and most importantly, your environment's going to probably be pretty similar each time. Um, the walls in your home, the way that the sound bounces around the room, all of that stuff is going to be pretty consistent episode to episode. It also means that your DAW of choice can be one that's more optimized, for example, for a computer environment, which may give you a little bit more tactile functions in the moment. You also want to consider that if you do need to do any sorts of on the go remote recording, your environment is going to be changing. If you're a podcast that does interviews, not all of your interviewees are going to have the same access to the gear that you do. Sometimes they may be calling in. If you're using something like Podbean Live, they may be calling in on their phone. And while Podbean Live is a great solution for being able to do remote recording, they, may not be in the same kind of studio setup that you are. If you're going to, let's say, a conference and you're interviewing somebody at a conference, you may be in a room with thousands of people. You may be in a hallway if you're doing a wrestling event and doing coverage of it. So you want to consider some of the gear that you might use. What's great is in 2020, a lot of the microphones and interfaces that you use can be mobile as well as be desktop. So, for example, if you're using an interface, a lot of these interfaces nowadays can plug into both a computer and an iOS device. By that end, also, a lot of this gear can translate to a laptop as well. So, in terms of the needs for all of them, definitely a microphone for sure you would need. A pop filter, I will always recommend as a need, an XLR cable for sure. But if you are using some more of the on the go remote recording solutions, you may even be able to get away and may want to experiment with those headphones that come with the Apple device, like the AirPods or not the AirPods, they don't come with it, the ear pods. So definitely consider what you would need for each of them. Also, if you find that you are doing more on the go remote recording, it may be worth investing in backup gear. So maybe if you have a microphone that you really like, it may be worth looking into a second one just to make sure you have it. Same thing with XLR cables. Pro tip also, every now and again, check your gear just to make sure that everything is functioning as expected. I like to do a gear check once a month just to make sure that my cables aren't torn, just to make sure I'm getting the same audio quality that I expect, and just to make sure that I'm not really caught with any sorts of issues when I go to hit record. And this is even more important when you're talking about the on the go recording solutions as well. Now, we've talked a lot about recording your podcast, but we've also talked a little bit about editing your podcast. Now, what does that mean? That means once you have the audio in your computer, what can you do to ensure that you're getting the most exact audio quality possible and the most professional podcasting quality? First and foremost, the thing that we talk about, make sure you're listening in for pause words and smacks and breath. So, what does that mean? Let's say you're doing an interview with somebody, for example, and you ask them a question and they didn't expect that question. And there's that downtime, there's that silence, and they go, well, oh, that's a really good point. What you can do is if you remove that little silence and those ums and uhs, you can remove those and make the podcast flow that much better. Now, again, when you're talking to somebody in the real world, this conversation will continue and flow. But when you're listening to a podcast episode, sometimes it can break the listener's engagement. So, listening to those, trying to remove those as much as possible can make sure that you have a pretty consistent listening experience for your listeners. The breaths and smacks also, as you listen in and as you do more podcast recording, they'll actually become way more prevalent over time. So if you remove some of those smacks, some of those plosives, some of those breaths, again, you want to remove all of the roadblocks for your listener to where they would get distracted and stop listening or really keep their focus. The breath, smacks, and the pause words are the three things that I will always recommend listening to and removing to make your podcast production as quality as possible. The final polishes we always talk about are mixing and mastering. Now, mixing is simply the art of making sure that all of your levels and all of your sounds for your intros, your outros, your voice, and anything else that you have are at the level that make sense for your podcast and are at a professional level. The mastering makes sure that your recording is at radio broadcast level, making sure that your podcast is at the same level as other podcasts that you enjoy. One thing I'll recommend always is listen to podcasts that you enjoy and listen to the podcasts that you think have the best quality. Try to make your podcast volume wise at the same level of those podcasts. You can go ahead and, for example, if you're using iTunes, you can play a podcast on there, listen to your mix, listen to your master, and try to match it with it. There's nothing wrong with taking influence and listening to and trying to replicate something from a podcast that you enjoy as well. I guarantee you the engineers for them have done it, and it can only cause your podcast to be that much more professional. One thing that I always bring up that I think is probably the biggest time saver and the way to add a lot of consistency between your episodes is called a DAW template. So let's say you have intro music. Let's say you have outro music. Let's say you have all of this content, right? And every time you go to record a podcast episode, you start up a brand new session in your software. So let's say you're using GarageBand. You have new podcast 1, new podcast 2, new podcast 3, new podcast 4. And every time you have to re-import your audio files, you have to re-import your intro music, your outro music, your transitions. You have to set up all the volumes, cut all of that out. What you can do is you can create a file, for example, that says like my podcast template, for example. And every time you go in to record your podcast or edit your podcast, use that file, use that session. Because then what you can do is you can make sure that all of your levels are basically where they should be. And it's going to cut down on the amount of editing time that you have. It's going to make sure that each episode to episode, there's more consistency between the quality of each episode. And again, it really comes down to, in my opinion, you want to be able to be as effective as possible while being as efficient as possible. And you shouldn't have to create multiple DAW. You shouldn't have to create multiple files for the DAW template. You should just create that one file, the one that says my podcast template, and just keep going back to that. It can only give you more time as well. And Ronnie actually put in a blog post that we did called How to Edit Your Podcast, which talks about a little bit deeper granularity of editing and using podcast DAW templates. Now, we're going to briefly go through a few of these here. We are running towards the end of the webinar, and I want to make sure I leave enough time for any questions that you may have. But here is my recommendation for a quick start professional level podcast layout. Now, first and foremost, sometimes with podcast recording, you may be trying to get everything prepped before you hit that record. Sometimes it is just about getting started, though. There's a reason why I keep saying the ear pods are really important. Those come with your mobile device. Don't shy away thinking that they would be poor audio quality. Don't think that just having a mobile device is poor audio quality. You can really just try to dive in here and just really talk about getting started. Just try it and see how the audio sounds and build out from there. Here, I have an iPhone, so I have the iPhone 7 Plus. That's my go-to model. That's the model I have. If you wanted to get a little bit more of a professional audio quality for your microphone, you can look into a mobile microphone that plugs right into the bottom called the Shure MV88, which runs about $150 or so. But what's nice about it is you can download a free app to adjust all the recording settings of the microphone. The Podbean app is a free app. If you're familiar with Podbean, you may know a bit about it. But what you may not know is that you can actually record and publish your podcast right from the Podbean app. So you don't need any extra gear. You don't need any extra interfaces. You don't need to export your podcast to your computer to upload it. You can do it all right from the app. So again, really the only extra cost here, if you went down that road, was the Shure MV88. But everything else is really what you already have or something that's complementary to you. Now, let's say you wanted to take your podcasting game to the next level. Let's say you went, you know what, that's great, but I want to be able to build out a little bit more of a studio. Then you can start looking into interfaces and start looking into microphones here as well. The first one I will talk about is the Focusrite Scarlett 2i2, which is very similar to the interface that we spoke about before, which runs about $150 or so. The running theme that you're going to continue to see from me is that it can be used for both Mac and iOS. So, as we talked about, a lot of the gear you want to be able to use a variety of different scenarios. You can use the interfaces we talked about to change the input gain on your microphones. And again, you want to be able to find yourself to no matter what situation you're in, you can use a similar kind of gear and keep your environment as synonymous as possible to any others that you've used before. The microphones that I recommend for dynamic microphones are the Samsung Q2Us, as we spoke about. These are each about $69 each. And again, they're USB or XLR compatible. You can put them on that microphone stand. They're dynamic microphones, so you can use them in a variety of different environments. In terms of the XLR cables, I will always recommend Mogami. They are some of the highest audio quality microphone cables that you can find. And also, they tout themselves on being great for noiseless quality, meaning you're not going to get any extra electrical hum from using these XLR cables. So definitely worth looking into here as well. In terms of headphones, I did just keep the ear pods on here or the AirPods, just again to make sure that I keep driving the point home that you don't have to break the bank on headphones, so long as you just have headphones. Now, let's say you went, you know what, I want to take it to the next level. That's totally fine. Basically, everything here is the same. The Shure SM58 is the next level dynamic microphone that I recommend. Basically, the same thing as the Samsung Q2U, just the Shure model. Now, the one thing I did add here is the Zoom H6 recorder. This here is a $349 interface, but what I like about it is it can be used for Mac, iOS. But let's say you leave the house, you forget all of your other stuff, you leave your phone at home, you leave your computer at home. This here, so long as you have an SD card plugged into it, has a microphone built into it. So you can use it as a standalone recorder. Also, it has 4 different inputs as well on it. So if you wanted to record up to 4 different people with 4 XLR cables and 4 independent microphones directly onto it, again, it's another way to make sure that you have a way to record in any kind of scenario. So what you're starting to see is each of these is building on kind of the professionalism, but all of them are going to give you great audio quality. It's just building more usage for you. Now, the one that I use, my desktop setup for recording music and podcasts, is I use the interface called the Apogee Duet, which it's probably one of my favorite interfaces. Again, can be used for mobile or desktop recording, and it can record 2 channels. I've used this on so many different music releases and about 300 podcast episodes right now. The microphone that I use is an NT1A by Rode, which I talked about earlier. I had bought it because it came with an XLR cable and a pop filter, but I was extremely impressed with the quality of the Rode microphone. I use those Mogami XLR cables as well, as we spoke about, and the headphones that I use are the Sennheiser 280 Pro. And again, I'm going through this a little bit quick, but when we do send this out for the video, you'll have access to review this content as well. So before I open it up for questions, I just want to leave a little bit of information here. So over on our resources tab here, you can find any information about our services at www.podbean.com. And for any further webinars that we have, this one was for recording. We have a bunch of different webinars coming up on how to promote your podcast, how to monetize your podcast, how to start podcasting in general, and how to do a live stream, how to bring podcasting into your place of work. We have a myriad of different webinars that are all free. So please feel free to register for any of them over at podbean.com/webinars. And if you liked what you saw today and found value in it, please feel free to shout us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and we'll be sure to retweet you as well. You can find a variety of different YouTube help videos over on youtube.com/podbeancom. You can contact me at johnk@podbean.com. And for any different resources that we may not necessarily have under our umbrella of services, we do recommend a variety of different vendors over at podbean.com/sites/resources. And you'll be able to see a variety of different transcription services, social media services, and hardware services that may also offer a little bit of a discount if you tell them you're from Podbean. I also want to thank Ronnie for running the chat for any questions that you may have. So everyone, please give Ronnie a big thank you. And I will open up any questions that you may have in the questions and answers section here.